On bright, crisp mornings, a striking optical effect may frequently be observed from the shadows of the higher mountains. While the sunbeams are pouring past overhead, then every insect, no matter what it may be its own proper color, burns white in the light. Gauzy winged Hymenoptera, moths, jet black beetles are all transfigured alike in pure spiritual white, like snowflakes. In Southern California, where bee culture has had no skillful attention of late years, the pasturage is not more abundant or advantageously varied as the number of its honey plants and their distribution over mountain and plain than that of many other portions of the state. While the industry currents slow in the other channels, the famous white sage belonging to the mint family flourishes here in all its glory, blooming in May and yielding great quantities of clear, pale honey, which is greatly prized in every market it has reached. This species grows chiefly in the valleys and low hills. The the black sage on the mountains is part of a dense, thorny, and chaparral, which is composed chiefly of Endostoma, Piothus, Manzita, and Cherry, not differing greatly from that of the southern portion of the Sierra, but more dense and continuous, and taller and remaining longer in blooms. Green side gardens, so charming a feature of both the Sierra and coast mountains, are less numerous in Southern California, but they are exceedingly rich in honey flowers whenever found. Melatotis columbine, Collistea verbena, Zaucheria, wild rose, honeysuckle, Philadelphus, and lilies, rising from the warm, moist dells in a very storm of exuberance. Wild buckwheat of many species is developed in abundance over the gray, sandy valleys and lower slopes of the mountains. Toward the end of summer, and it is at this time the main dependence of the bees, reinforced here and there by orange groves, alfalfa fields, and small home gardens. The main honey months in this ordinary season are April, May, June, July, and August, while the other months are usually flowery enough to yield sufficient for the bees. According to Mr. J.T. Gordon, president of the Los Angeles County Beekeepers Association, the first bees introduced into the county were a single hive, which cost $150 in San Francisco and arrived in September 1854. In April of the following year, this hive sent out 2 swarms, which were sold for $100 each. From this small beginning, the bees gradually multiplied to about 3,000 swarms in the year 1873. In 1876, it was estimated that there were between 15,000 and 20,000 hives in this county, producing an annual yield of about 100 pounds to the hive. In some exceptional cases, much greater yield. In San Diego County, at the beginning of the season of 1878, there were about 24,000 hives, and the shipments from the one port of San Diego from the same year, from about July 17th to November 10th, were 10,071 barrels, 15,544 cases, and nearly 90 tons. The largest bee ranches have about 1,000 hives and are carefully and skillfully managed. Every scientific appliance of merit being brought into use. There are few beekeepers, however, who own half as many as this, or who give their undivided attention to the business. Orange culture, at present, is heavily overshadowing every other business. A good many of the so-called bee ranches of Los Angeles and San Diego countries are still of the rudest pioneer kind imaginable. A man unsuccessful in everything else hears the interesting story of the profits and comforts of beekeeping and concludes to try it. He buys a few colonies or gets them from some overstocked ranch on shares and takes them back to the foot of some canyon where the pasturage is fresh, squats on the land with or without the permission of the owner, sets up his hives, makes a box cabin for himself, scarcely bigger than a beehive, and awaits his fortune. Bees suffer sadly from famine during the dry years which occasionally occur in southern and middle portions of the state. If the rainfall amounts only to 3 or 4 inches instead of from 12 to 20 as in ordinary pastures, then sheep and cattle die in thousands, and so do these small winged cattle. Unless they are carefully fed or removed to their pastures, the year 1877 will be long remembered as exceptionally rainless and distressing. Scarcely a flower bloomed on the dry valleys away from the stream sides, and not a single grain field depending upon rain was reaped. The seed only sprouted, came up a little way, and withered. Horses, cattle, and sheep grew thinner day by day, nibbling at bushes and weeds along the shallowing edges of streams, and many of which were dried up altogether for the first time since the settlement of the country. In the course of a trip I made during the summer of that year through Monterey, San Luis Obispo, Santa Barbara, Ventura, and Los Angeles counties, the deplorable effects of the drought were everywhere visible. Leafless fields, dead and dying cattle, dead bees, and half-dead people with dusty, doleful faces. Even the birds and squirrels were in distress, though their suffering was less painfully apparent than that of the poor cattle. These were failing one by one in slow, sure starvation along the banks of the hot, sluggish streams, while thousands of buzzards correspondingly fat were sailing above them, or standing gorged on the ground beneath the trees, waiting with easy faith for fresh carcasses. The quail, prudently considering the hard times, abandoned all thoughts of pairing. They were too poor to marry, and so continued in flocks all through the year without attempting to rear young. The ground squirrels, though an exceptionally industrious and enterprising race, as every farmer knows, were hard pushed for a living. Not a fresh leaf or seed was to be found, save in the trees, whose bossy masses of dark green foliage presented a striking contrast to the ashen baldness of the ground beneath them. The squirrels, leaving their accustomed feeding grounds, betook themselves to the leafy oaks to gnaw out the acorn stores of the provident woodpeckers. But the latter kept up a vigilant watch upon their movements. I noticed 4 woodpeckers in league against 1 squirrel, driving the poor fellow out of an oak that they claimed. He dodged around the knotty trunk from side to side as nimbly as he could in his famished condition, only to find a sharp bill everywhere. But the fate of the bees that year seemed the saddest of all. In different portions of Los Angeles and San Diego counties, from 1/2 to 3/4 of them died in sheer starvation. Not less than 18,000 colonies perished in 2 counties alone, while in the adjacent counties the death rate was hardly less. Even the colonies nearest to the mountains suffered this year, for the smaller vegetation of the foothills was affected by the droughts almost as severely as that of the mountains and plains, and even the hardy, deep-rooted chaparral, the surest dependence of the bees, bloomed sparingly. While much of it was beyond reach, every swarm could have been saved, however, by promptly supplying them with food and their own stores began to fail, and before they became enfeebled and discouraged. or by cutting roads back into the mountains and taking them into the heart of the flowery chaparral. The Santa Lucia, San Rafael, San Gabriel, San Joaquito, and San Bernardino ranges were almost untouched as yet, save by the wild bees. Some idea of their resources and of the advantages and disadvantages they offer to the beekeeper may be formed for an excursion that I made into the San Gabriel range. About the beginning of August of the dry year, this range, containing most of the characteristic features of the other ranges just mentioned, overlooks the Los Angeles vineyards and orange groves from the north and is more richly inaccessible to the ordinary meaning of the word than any other that I have ever attempted to penetrate. The slopes are exceptionally steep and insecure to the foot, and they are covered with thorny bushes from 5 to 10 feet high, with the exception of little spots not visible in general views. The entire surface is covered with them, massed in close hedge growth, sweeping gracefully down into every gorge and hollow, and swelling over every ridge and summit in shaggy, ungovernable exuberance, offering more honey to the acre for half the year than the most crowded clover fields. But when beheld upon from the open San Gabriel Valley, beaten with dry sunshine, all that was seen of the range seemed to wear a forbidding aspect. From base to summit, all seemed gray and barren, silent. Its glorious chaparral appearing like dry moss creeping over its dull, wrinkled ridges and hollows.